It's a pleasure not only to be able to work on issues of equality in Hong Kong for myself, but also have an interest in these issues because I actually used to work at a national human rights institution, which is the Equality and Human Rights Commission in the UK. And I was lucky enough to be involved in setting that up and applying for and getting A status as a national human rights institution several years ago. So it's wonderful to be here today. First of all, hopefully you all know who that is, especially everyone that works at a national human rights institution. Anyone know who that is? Eleanor Roosevelt. Obviously many people know her husband. Often the women do get overlooked, but I would describe her as one of the founding mothers of the modern human rights movement. And she was instrumental in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which, as Dr. Samar said, was signed almost 70 years ago. And one crucial aspect of human rights protection is, of course, the right to equality. And you can see that from the Article 2 there. Aspects of identity, whether it's race, sex, disability, sexual orientation, are often the source of discrimination, prejudice, stereotypes, and so on. And that is as important and apparent as it was in 1948, as it is, of course, today around the world. And from that Universal Declaration, of course, since then, in the 60s, we had the ICCPR, the Economic and Social Rights Convention, and more recently, the CERD Convention in relation to racial discrimination, CEDAW for women, and most recently, the CRPD for people with disabilities in 2008. But I wanted to mention that because, of course, the focus of our conference over the next 2 days is on issues of equality, and those are central, of course, to various human rights protections. As some of you know, national human rights institutions actually exist now, at my last count when I looked on the UN's website, 79 of them who have A status, which means they have the maximum in terms of their remit and as recognized by the UN. And there's a map there showing the various institutions around the world. I would like to explain our remit at the EOC, because already quite a few of you from overseas have said, so what is the EOC? Well, the first thing to say is we're not a human rights institution as recognized by the UN. The reason why is that, as Professor Chan said, our remit at the moment is restricted to the 4 anti-discrimination laws in Hong Kong. We don't have a wider remit of other human rights issues. But in other contexts, in terms of our powers, duties, roles, we do perform similar functions to national institutions here today. So for example, as Professor Chan said, we have the right to provide legal assistance, we conduct investigations, we do research, we do education, we advocate for changes in the law. So in that respect, we are hopefully performing and doing similar work. So in the context of Hong Kong, and in terms of our discussions over the next 2 days, hopefully this will help you if you're from overseas, we have 3 levels of human rights laws. We have the UN core conventions, which the Hong Kong government has signed up to all of those 7. We then have constitutional laws, which is the Bill of Rights and the Basic Law. So someone asked me, I think it was Rosalind actually, the Bill of Rights in Hong Kong is equivalent to your constitutions which have human rights provisions in your countries. It actually implements into Hong Kong law the ICCPR, and that includes the right to non-discrimination. And it includes areas which are currently not actually in our 4 anti-discrimination laws. So for example, as Professor Chan mentioned, issues of LGBT equality, we've had cases which have held that sexual orientation is a protected characteristic under the Bill of Rights. So although, as Professor Chan said, we're restricted in terms of our anti-discrimination laws, but the Bill of Rights does go further. The problem is that only covers the government and the public sector. It doesn't cover the private sector. Just to explain, the Basic Law covers the relationship between Hong Kong and mainland China, and that's because, as some of you hopefully know, we have still one country, two systems. So the legal system in Hong Kong is still completely different from the legal system in mainland China. So that's very important to understand. And then going back to this conference, in terms of setting this up, we wanted to focus on what are the common issues in terms of concerns of equality in Hong Kong and in the Asia Pacific. And just to give you an idea of what they are, and we'll be talking about this more over the next 2 days, in Hong Kong for women, some of the biggest issues, as in many other parts of the world, are sexual harassment in the workplace and other contexts, and also issues of equal opportunities in employment. So, for example, the areas where we receive most complaints at the EOC are sexual harassment and pregnancy discrimination. But there are other issues relating to women. So, for example, Hong Kong has actually one of the worst maternity provisions in terms of numbers of weeks in Asia, which it's actually worse than mainland China, which many people are surprised by. So there's a lot of room for improvement in Hong Kong for women's rights. In terms of racial equality, one of the biggest issues is, and this has already been mentioned by Dr. Samar, is poverty of ethnic minorities. So particularly Pakistanis, Nepalese, those groups are disproportionately in poverty in Hong Kong, and that's often linked to issues of education, problems of learning Chinese, and also problems of getting good quality work, which are all interrelated. We also have issues of discrimination against migrant workers, and particularly there are a huge number, 330,000 foreign domestic workers in Hong Kong. So they often face issues, for example, of pregnancy discrimination or sexual harassment. And then finally, people with disabilities. You may have noticed in Hong Kong there is a problem of accessibility for anyone. So you can imagine how difficult accessibility is for people with disabilities. There's also a huge problem of them being disproportionately unrepresented in employment. And then finally, and this is something we're going to talk about in one of the panel discussions, there is a relationship between an aging society, which many developing countries have, and therefore higher numbers of people who become disabled. So these are the sorts of issues that we face in Hong Kong. We know that they are issues that you face in your countries, and hopefully these are issues that we will explore more over the next 2 days. So I'll leave it at that, but we now are going to have, we're lucky to have an actual representative of the United Nations with us today. And Katia Shirizi, it's Shirizi, so Italian. Katia is Italian. I thought she was Polish because Katia I always thought was a Polish name. And she is the Deputy Regional Representative of the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights in the Southeast Asia Regional Office. And she joined that office in 2007, previously working in Nepal, heading the field office for the anti-discrimination section. She's also worked in several countries of the Asia-Pacific region, including the Maldives, Sri Lanka, India, Bhutan, Bangladesh, and Myanmar. So she has a rich understanding of the issues. Before joining the OHCHR, she was the deputy, she was working at the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe in Kosovo and Serbia. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Ms. Shirizi.
Very good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for the warm welcome and introduction. Let me start by saying I'm really honored and privileged to be with all of you with such a rich audience. And I would really like to thank the Hong Kong Equal Opportunity Commission and the APF for having extended the invitation to our office to join this important event. I would like to just specify at the offset of my overview that I will be primarily looking at Southeast Asia as my own focus, just because that is the coverage of my own regional office. It looks specifically this sub-region. So I will not be looking at the broader scope of the Asia-Pacific region. And also, likewise, I will primarily be looking at some discrimination or issues related to inequalities vis-a-vis women, migrants, persons with disabilities. And but again, with appreciating that the scope of inequality experience in the sub-region is much broader than that. The principles of equality and non-discrimination, of course, are at the heart of human rights, and my overview comes after the very eloquent presentations of Professor Chang and Dr. Sima. So it's just humbling to just follow on your very inspirational remarks at the beginning of this conference. Peter has gone through the international human rights mechanisms, both broadly and as applicable to Hong Kong. And I thought it would be interesting, of course, having that in mind, but also looking at another important process which started a few years ago and still has 15 years ahead of us, which is the 2030 Agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals. And of course, leave no one behind, which is the core principle of the agenda, and which is directly linked to the focus of this conference. And leave no one behind, of course, means that we need to uphold everyone's rights, and this is precisely because the economies and societies that are inclusive and participative, and where government is accountable, those countries can better stand shocks. And because whether it is on the basis of sex, ethnicity, sexual orientation, political opinion, religious belief, or any other supposedly defining characteristic, discrimination and human rights violations are responsible for deep injustice, which harms just as much individuals and communities. The 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda is one of the most recent and most authoritative reiteration of that long-standing call to ensure equality of opportunity and the end of mindless discrimination. The agenda deepest and overarching promise is to leave no one behind. And the details of this commitment are made clear through two main goals: promote gender equality, Goal 5, and reduce inequalities within and among countries, which is Goal 10. While both globally and in the region, gender equality is gradually reducing in areas such as health and education, this process is often followed by backlash and retrogressive blows, and policies which are restricting women's equal enjoyment of rights, discriminatory stereotypes, and harmful practices. And the gender gap in economic participation and the gender digital divide also have been widening within the past 5 years. International human rights law prohibits discrimination on the basis of sex and includes guarantees for men and equal to equally enjoy their civil, cultural, economic, political, and social rights equally. And at the same time, the call on states who have ratified CEDAW to take all appropriate measures, including legislation to modify and abolish existing laws, regulations, customs, and practices which constitute discrimination against women. CEDAW has been ratified by all states in Southeast Asia, but yet there is a high number of reservation to core articles, such as Article 2 and Article 6, which has an impact on young girls and women and on their personal and family life. And 5 out of 11 states of the region have ratified the optional protocol of CEDAW, which allows the submission of individual or community complaints to the committee itself. All Southeast Asian countries have laws against discrimination in the workplace, and equal pay for equal work is protected by law. But yet there is still a significant economic disparity between men and women. And as indicated in by the Asia Pacific SDG Progress Report, the latest one looking at 2017, Southeast Asia has not successfully reduced inequalities, and I think this applies more broadly, certainly, than Southeast Asia. It's an element which is equally applicable more widely to the Asia Pacific region. But in Southeast Asia, not only it has not advanced, but it has been retrogressing. In several states of the region, women lack equal property rights, and the rights to customary land is curtailed. And they're much less likely to get adequate jobs and much less likely to be able to make their own choices as men are. Let me now also move to discrimination based on sexual orientation and sexual identity, social stigma, homophobia, and transphobia, which remains high in Southeast Asia. No country in the region has sexual orientation and gender identity protections as part of their own constitutions, no provisions for same-sex marriage or for legal civil unions for either heterosexual or homosexual couples. And this includes, for instance, students experiencing bullying and discrimination in schools because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. In the region, as it was also mentioned before, more legislative and policy measures are needed to guarantee equal participation in public life by persons with disability. And this also includes allocating adequate resources for accessibility-friendly infrastructures and institutions, which has a direct impact on the enjoyment of the full spectrum of rights. And let me now move to the rights of minorities. And here, in several countries across the Asia-Pacific region, those rights are being neglected or abandoned. All of us are painfully aware of the disgraceful atrocities against the Rohingya. But it would be simply impossible to enumerate the full list of minorities whose rights are currently being violated and neglected. Again, I'm looking at Southeast Asia, but of course this is more broadly applicable to the entire Asia-Pacific region. And let me also emphasize how women from minority communities face additional burdens. They're more likely to live in poverty. Their access to health services and their progress in education, the right to shelter, to live free from fear and participate in decision-making are curtailed by multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination. Moving to asylum seekers, including those whom the United Nations recognizes as refugees, many of them continue to be treated in several countries in the region as illegal migrants and subject to arrest and deportation. And migrant workers are vulnerable to physical abuses, indefinite detention, severe labor rights abuses, and exploitation by their own employers, and exposed to violence and human trafficking. Again, female domestic workers frequently face abuse, harassment, and exploitation in the workplace, and this includes servitude, sexual harassment, physical mistreatment, and the withholding of their own payment. So if we look at the progress made so far in terms of equalities and ensuring equal opportunities for these groups, including within the context of the 2030 agenda, but certainly also in the context of human rights commitments made by member states by ratifying international human rights instruments, the progress is still pretty low. And looking at the SDGs, reducing inequalities is where we have even seen a regression. Now, we look at the future and what can be done, this being the situation. Certainly, everyone has a role to play. Member states who need to uphold the commitments they have made by ratifying international human rights mechanism, and also through the pledges which have been made within the 2030 agenda. National human rights institutions, there are many gathered in this room today, as a national human rights protection mechanism. On one hand, calling member states accountable, and on the other one, supporting rights holders and their claims to achieve equality. And certainly civil society organizations with their tireless advocacy and efforts made to secure and support claims to achieve equality, and whose work is often made by very high protection risk, which translate into harassment, intimidation, and in more severe case, even enforced disappearances and even death, as we are all sadly reminded on a regular basis. And certainly the UN, my office, and a number of other international organizations in delivering our mandate and engaging with all concerned stakeholders in supporting the way forward towards pursuing equality. I would just like to emphasize an aspect which I believe is very important, and this is the need to collect quality, sufficient, and appropriate data, and disaggregated data, because unless we have disaggregated information, we're not going to be able to provide evidence-based information of how inequality impacts on different groups differently, depending on their own situation. We can simply not accept as inevitable that the life of so many individuals is predetermined by the color of their skin, their ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, place of birth, or their religious belief. So several countries have been engaged in developing legislation or policy in support of diversity and cohesion, and it would be very important to take stock of those examples and document those good practices in order to also support a dialogue on what can be done precisely to overcome so many widespread and existing inequalities. And this conference, of course, is a very good opportunity to advance that dialogue. Then I would just like to end, as it was mentioned before, that, of course, this year we mark and celebrate the 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, where the principle of equality is a key cornerstone. So I think, and I hope, and I wish that we all have a role to play to translate the principle of equality enshrined in the Declaration into reality for everyone, but with particular focus, of course, on the rights of those who are vulnerable, marginalized, and on a daily basis experience discrimination and inequality. And so with that, I would like to wish everyone a very productive discussion over the coming sessions until tomorrow. And again, thank you very much for giving us this opportunity.
We're now going to focus on the particular situation of Hong Kong, and we're very lucky to have joining us Professor Fanny Cheung. She is currently the Pro-Vice Chancellor of the Chinese University of Hong Kong, but she previously was our first chairperson. So it's a great honor that she can join us today and reflect on where we have gone over the last 20 years in Hong Kong. She's an active advocate for promoting women's rights, and she also established the Gender Research Center at the Chinese University in 1985, so has tremendous experience on these issues. Can you please welcome Professor Cheung?
Good afternoon, distinguished participants. It's my great pleasure and honor to come home to the EOC and to participate in this conference. It gives me an opportunity to reflect on the work that we started about 22 years ago. And I'm still very glad to see many of my former colleagues here. It's really a homecoming. Well, first of all, let me go through what I'm going to present. I'm an educator, so I use PowerPoint, and I use outlines. But as you can tell later on, as an educator, that's how we set up the EOC with a more inclusive educational framework, more than just a legal framework. So I'd like to start with the foundation of the EOC. It was established in May 1996 under the Sex Discrimination Ordinance, which was enacted in 1995, but brought into effect in 1996 with the establishment of the EOC. So the first two ordinances were the Sex Discrimination Ordinance and the Disability Discrimination Ordinance. And the enactment of these two ordinances came as the result of very active campaign and advocacy of the women's groups and the disability groups. So it was really a ground-up type of advocacy. And you probably noticed that this is just before the reunification with China. So it was set up before Hong Kong returned to China, but it was really a through train. We didn't really have any changes in our system and structure. So you can see that under the one country, two system, the EOC is still very much intact, very much effective, and we're still carrying on our work. However, now, if I reflect back on when we first started, some of you who were with us at that time, we really have to go through a lot of public skepticism, misconceptions, and probably some of these queries are still with us today. People often tell us, no, men and women are different. They cannot be equal. No, you still hear that a lot today. Probably less explicit than before because they now know there's an EOC. Well, then the employers at that time were saying the laws will create more interpersonal conflict and litigation and therefore increase costs of doing business. You still hear that type of argument every time we introduce anything that would bring more labor laws or bring any more benefits to the employees. But I'm glad to tell you that by the time I left the EOC, the employers have come around. They found us a helpful ally to help them to introduce best practice in business. And I was telling them that this is a modern way of doing business. No, you are just too old-fashioned. And they learned that there are better ways of doing business. Then at the other end of the spectrum, some of the activists were saying that if one is being treated unfairly, it's discrimination. Why is the EOC not taking all these discriminators into, well, actually, they were asking us to punish them. And under our ordinance, we do not have that power. And it is not the responsibility of the EOC to go out and catch all the violators. In fact, they were having these very traditional Chinese concept of justice. I think in the audience, our Chinese friends all know about Justice Bao Qingting, who is not only the prosecutor, the judge, but also the executor. Everything in one. And that is the Chinese concept of justice at that time. And so the EOC is under a lot of criticism for not taking the role of Justice Bao. But as a psychologist myself, not a lawyer, when we started the EOC, I thought, well, we need to change not only unlawful behavior, we need to change beliefs, we need to change culture. So we set up a 4 strategic pillars for the EOC. First and foremost, of course, we have to implement the complaints and legal measures under the provisions of the law. But very importantly, we need to have research and advocacy. Facts and figures speak louder than a lot of the disbeliefs or the misconceptions. And we can show people the facts, the figures, that demonstrate that there is inequality. I still remember the first time I had to go to Legislative Council to explain why we need to enact these laws and why the EOC is needed. one of the male legislators saying, hey, women is doing so well in Hong Kong. They overwhelmed the civil service. Because at that time, Anson Chan was the chief secretary. So, women are dominating the government. And so I told him, well, according to our figures, only about 23% of the senior civil service officers are women. They're not even half. How can they be dominant? How can they be predominant and the majority? That doesn't add up. So he shut up. So you don't really need to use a lot of force. You can just show them the facts. So research and advocacy is very much part of the founding pillars of the EOC. And then public education training. Particularly for the employers, they're very scared because they said, no, the law is coming into effect. Now we are going to face up with a lot of litigation, and we don't know what to do. And they have been carrying on these very conventional practices. For example, stating the presence for females or secretaries in the newspaper advertisement, and asking for males for their managers. And we counted at that time about 2/3 of the employment advertisements discriminatory. But instead of just getting all the lawyers and also the newspapers into court, we decided to promote an educational campaign. We showed them what's the best practice for advertisement, how they can ask for genuine skills rather than gender as the basis for their employment. So we promoted a lot of public education and training, but at the same time, we need to engage the community, we need to engage partners. So it's very important for us to build networks and community participation. And I'm glad to see that to this day, the EOC still have committees and different functions that carry on these strategic pillars. So if we look at the complaint and legal measures and some of the work and achievement they have maintained throughout the years, including publishing code of practice under the various discrimination ordinance. There are judicial review, of course, the most famous, and sometimes to the schools it's infamous, because EOC brought a judicial review against the Director of Education for the sex discrimination in the secondary school placement scheme. And to this day, some of the school principals are saying that because of the EOC now, all the elite schools become girls' schools. But I was actually telling them, no, it's not just the law. Now, if you think a little bit more seriously about basic education, why are boys not doing as well in their school performance, even though they were doing pretty well with their aptitude test? But unfortunately, in the placement scheme, they were not using the aptitude test for various reasons. But I said, if you start thinking of changing the school curriculum, making learning much more active, much more fun, boys would do much better in school. But to this day, I don't think they have changed. They're still using a lot of rote memory, examination-oriented curriculum. And so, no, that hasn't really improved. But the school principals are blaming the EOC because of that. And we have reviewed legislation. And I won't go through the figures, but these are some of the activities that the EOC is conducting through investigating complaints, facilitating conciliation, and providing legal advice and assistance, and also initiated investigation throughout the 22 years. And so we have helped a lot of individual cases. Research and advocacy over the 22 years, the EOC has commissioned over 40 research projects to understand perceptions and status of equal opportunities and discrimination issues. These are very helpful for us to target how we can promote public education, what are the areas that we need to concentrate in terms of our advocacy and promotion. it's very important to bring in evidence-based discussion and policy analysis, and setting up special groups to examine particular issues, for example, about accessibility and education for ethnic minorities. Public education, when we first started, people don't even know what EOC is about. So we had a lot of publicity programs to reach out to the general public. We also published a lot of best practices and guidelines. And I know to this day, the EOC Club is engaging a lot of the employers as partners and promoting these best practices. We designed training modules, especially in the early days, how to have more equal opportunities employment practices, how to avoid sex discrimination or disability discrimination as employers. What is sexual harassment? That is the most challenging topic for the public to understand. I think to this day, we still haven't achieved that full understanding. I can see some of the gaps still. It's also very important to train the trainers because EOC is a small office. There are only, at the time when we started, we have 60 staff. How many do you have now? 96. Well, at least, that's an improvement. But still, 96 people is not going to be able to change Hong Kong. So we need to train the trainers, and we need to help people to understand. And we have established resource centers, seminars, and workshops. But through some of the regional and international network, and also through some of our community participation schemes, we have built up more networks to help us to form alliances to promote equal opportunities. Well, achievements. Well, some of the things that EOC can proudly say is that now almost everyone should know about EOC in Hong Kong. That's awareness of the EOC. Starting from when we started, only 35% has heard what the EOC is. Now, 98% have heard about the EOC. However, knowing about the EOC doesn't mean that they understand what is discrimination, what is equal opportunities. So we still have some way to go, but still, general public, in terms of the anti-discrimination attitude index, about 60, they have a point, 62 points. It's not the 62%, but out of a scale of 100, the general public has achieved 62 points, and for service users who have come across EOC services, they have a higher anti-discrimination attitude index. And usually for young people, single people, local bonds, they have better awareness. Well, some of the legal actions, I won't go through them again, but these are some of the achievements throughout the years that we have been able to bring cases to court to establish the case laws, and also bring amendments to the existing legislation to improve its coverage. However, I'd like to bring out some of the gaps. Well, first of all, and I'll focus just on more on the sex discrimination side because there are so many other areas that are not being covered. First of all, organizational commitment to equal opportunities and diversity policies are still weak, even though we have allies. But if we look at some of the studies, especially of the small and medium-sized enterprises, they do not seem to have a good understanding of the discrimination ordinances. Even with larger ordinances, they are more likely to provide briefing, but not written policies and guidelines. And if you look at the sexual harassment survey for educational sector, we have over 700 schools not returning the survey, which means very likely that they have not yet established a policy statement. Even for the university, when I started, we had all 8 universities setting up the policies. But every year with the student orientation, they still have all these scandals in the newspapers. Well, we need to bring higher awareness into the public. But if you look at the survey, EOC and enhanced public understanding of equal opportunities, that the support has dwindled. I think we need to work harder again. And general awareness of equal opportunities remains superficial. There's still a lot of myths, misconceptions, and sexual harassment. Public is still very confused what constitutes sexual harassment and sexually hostile environment. Future challenges for Hong Kong, particularly in the sex discrimination side. How do we protect equal opportunities across borders? As we become more global, people travel across borders. Local norms and laws differ, and we have cultural and regional differences, especially if we start thinking about the Greater Bay Area. Our people, our citizens, traveling across borders with all very different norms and laws. How can we protect their rights and interests? How do we set best practice outside of Hong Kong? And then how do we align intersectionality of discrimination based on multiple dimensions: gender, age, ethnicity, race, and sexual orientation? Intersectionality, it's a sociological concept. It means that discrimination have multidimensional perspective, and oftentimes it's not just one single system. So when you say women are doing pretty well, maybe for educated women we are doing better than less educated women. For poorer women, for people in the grassroots, for ethnic minority women, there are multiple dimensions of discrimination. Well, what we need to do, promote is transformative equality. It's not just equal opportunities in the formal sense, and that people should be treated the same all the time. Sometimes being treated the same does not lead to equality. We need substantive equality, and more importantly, we need transformative equality. Now, given the limitation of time, I just show you the pictures which tells 1,000 words. Formal equality means that you are treated the same. So you're given the same stools to stand on the fence, to try to peep over the fence. For people like me, you probably can't see over the fence. Substantive equality, you try to put higher stools and give ladders to people to watch over the fence, but they still can't be part of the inclusive society. So what we want is transformative equality, where they can be part of the society. They would be integrated into this and diversity. So when we still need to challenge some of these skepticism, it's maybe easier if we go back to our grounding values. Why do we need equal opportunities? We need basic human dignity, mutual respect, safe and friendly environment, appreciation of diversity, and inclusive society. That's why we need equal opportunities. Thank you.